Next up, our working group on adapted grants will share a perspective on how grants can be designed to encourage and enable adaptation. So you'll notice this question is a consistent theme of this summit because of its great importance. And this perspective is not intended to be an exhaustive answer to this complex question. It's intended to be a contribution to a vibrant sector-wide discussion on this topic, which of course includes work by GLAM, DFID, ODI, USAID CLA program, and many others. So this presentation identifies a set of challenges and potential solutions based on the contributors' experience, and it was created as a contribution to that broader conversation. After the presentation, we have time reserved for discussion and feedback live with the audience, where we welcome you to share further ideas and advice, and we will use that audience feedback to inform the final publication of this perspective, which will be coming out in coming weeks. So thank you for your feedback and for making this a collectively developed publication. Welcome to our 8 working group members. We have Farouk Yusuf from Society for Family Health, David Olayemi from CS Sun, Trevor Rees from Adaptive Change Advisors, Christina Synowiec from Results for Development, Ritika Pandey from IPE Global, Reshma Trasi from Resolve, and Palaia from USAID, and Abi Gleek from Everyone Mobile. So I will now hand over to the working group to share their presentation.
Hey all, I'm Ritika from IP Global. Yes, you guessed right. I've transitioned from Digital Green to a new role at IP Global. It is indeed my pleasure to meet all of you at the final Curve Summit. This summit, I must say, is the best example of adapting to the situation, the COVID situation, and changing strategies to get the desired results. Converting the final summit into an e-summit, as travels were not possible, speaks about how the MNC Saatchi team adapted in response to the situation. On that positive note, I would like to present our work on how proposals can be designed from the outset to facilitate adaptation. Let me begin by introducing my team members, Christina, Reshma, Anne, Farouk, Abi, David, and Trevor. We have tried to have an interesting mix of implementers and donors to get a holistic view on the important yet complex topic at hand. Everyone understands the value of adaptive programming, of collecting and using data to make decisions that improve program or project outcomes. Taking small bets that allow us to build on success and learn from interventions that are not so successful. We use rapid feedback loops based on context analysis and program monitoring to adapt and improve implementation. We also change strategies, plans, and actions to meet an overall goal in response to new information. The real challenge lies in designing programs which can effectively perform in response to emerging changes. And we all know that the process of designing a program starts at designing proposals effectively. So to effectively address this adaptive mechanism, the proposals must have feedback mechanisms built in from the outset. So how can we really develop proposals that have feedback mechanism built in? How should we really frame the theory of change and the learning questions in the proposals so that they can be continually tested, investigated, and adapted? All this may vary by type of proposals, motivation for adaptation, request by donors, clients, or necessitated by context or driven by organization culture and leadership style. To answer this, we bring to you our collective experience in the form of 7 presentations, which focus on challenges and solutions that our group has come up with. The second half of the session is an opportunity for you, the audience, to share your own experience and insights on this topic. The insights that are shared during the session will then feed into the final written publication that our group shares on this topic. So look forward to your contributions and the presentations from my team members. Thank you.
My name is Trevor Rees and I work with Adaptive Change Advisors. I'm going to speak briefly about 3 things to consider when developing proposals that take account of the need for adaptation. These concepts are drawn from the Adaptive Leadership Framework and are of course relevant throughout all phases of project implementation. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the importance of recognising that projects typically include a mixture of elements that, using the language of adaptive leadership, we call technical and adaptive. In general terms, we might describe adaptive problems as those where more learning is needed. The issue is complex and not fully understood, whereas technical problems may be complicated, but there's probably an understanding of the problem and the intended solution is known. Any proposal is likely to address a mix of both technical and adaptive issues. It's important to be clear about the value of technical elements, which might account for 90% of the work, with the adaptive components comprising a much smaller but important proportion. In a proposal, this relates to risk and uncertainty. Much about the technical solution is known, but there are adaptive elements where more learning is needed. Strong technical solutions are enormously important. Think about medical interventions. You don't want a surgeon learning and improvising their way through a cardiac procedure, but understanding the behaviours that contribute to the patient ending up in surgery in the first place. This is where adaptive learning is invaluable. Next, projects do not exist in a vacuum. The proposal you're developing probably builds on work already carried out, but maybe there are also some new elements that you're looking to incorporate. So as you're planning this new project, think about which parts of the work delivered previously are still important to the new direction. Similarly, there may be aspects of the historical approach that are no longer appropriate. These may be practices, partners or policies, or something else that is no longer completely relevant, and so should be let go. We can consider these as legacy, core and emerging aspects of our work. It's important to see that a lot of things will remain. These are core to developing a new approach, but being able to recognise that giving up on certain historical practices allows you to take on the new emerging elements. And this is where adaptation is needed. Typically, adaptation implies some kind of change or loss. Even at the proposal stage, there may be clients, colleagues reluctant to take on new approach because this is the way that we've always done it. Understanding that they have something at stake related to the previous work may help you to secure support internally for your new initiative. And for donors, seeing the legacy that a new proposal draws upon can build confidence in what might otherwise be seen as a novel and untested approach. I wanted to say something about the importance of developing trusted relationships between stakeholders in the funding system. Funders and project implementers are both interested in solving problems, but they may have different loyalties and accountabilities, and therefore the work of building these relationships needs to take these loyalties and values into account. There's a saying from adaptive leadership: there's no such thing as a dysfunctional system. This means that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. Creating the conditions for the system to actively support the development of more adaptive proposals requires change in the way that the parts of the system work together, and we should recognise that doing things differently may result in uncertainty and even discomfort for project developers as well as donors. As with the legacy, core and emerging concept, there will be much that does not need to change, but the opportunity is to identify those areas where learning can be of greatest value. Preparing for this disruptive work means building a strong holding environment where people are prepared to talk about what they don't know as well as the things they're certain of. This preparatory work takes time, but is critically important. In closing, I would just say that adaptation and learning are two sides of the same coin and integral to achieving impact. Being able to articulate this clearly at the proposal stage helps to lay the groundwork for a continued, ongoing process. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about the need to adapt our approaches to data for decision making. in order to facilitate the analysis of our responsive feedback loops and to reap the benefits from them. And I'll suggest some practical approaches to doing that, which we can build in from the proposal stage. So we all know that historically, the gold standard of research and evidence has been seen to be randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. They occupy a hallowed spot in global health, and because of this, in some cases, donors might expect to see them included in proposals, or might view proposals centered on a responsive feedback mechanism-driven approach to be less desirable. It's therefore really important that we know how to express the value of taking a dynamic approach to our data, and that we have the tools in place to enable us to leverage the benefit of a dynamic data approach. Now, expressing the benefit will be covered later in this presentation, so I'll be focusing on the practical shifts in mindsets and tools needed to allow for problem solving using real-time data. So here's some initial potential solutions gathered by this working group for how to put this into practice. So one is to use dynamic measurement. If we recognize the benefit that flexibility affords us, which can be important to emphasize in a proposal, adaptive work in its very nature changes, so we need dynamic measurement methodologies to capture output and understand what works. This flexibility comes in terms of types of evidence, types of study, and timeframes. So for types of evidence, the programs that I run are digital, so we're lucky that our data is truly real-time. And I strongly believe that most programs can benefit from leveraging digital approaches in some form to feed into real-time data. But we still supplement the what data we see on our digital platform with other forms of evidence to provide additional why context. For instance, we run focus groups, surveys, and key informant interviews to help build the broader picture, and we design and run these in an agile way based on what we want to understand in that cycle. We also build in use of tacit evidence when looking at understanding what comes through on our real-time digital dashboards. Gathering insights from the broader stakeholder network, local organizations working in the same space, members of relevant institutions, and of course, internal team members across our program. Now for types of study. Not to say that an RCT and an RFM are mutually exclusive, but running RFMs opens up a remit of other possibilities for study design. Rapid testing of theory assumptions, rapid implementation testing through comparison of A/B cohorts, even micro tweaks to implementation approaches can form an RFM to garner insight and learning and optimize impact more quickly. And timeframes. This flexibility in types of evidence and types of study allows us to rethink traditional monitoring cycles. We don't have to wait for slow research instruments. We have insights at our fingertips on a much more regular basis, which means we can be getting together as a team to assess progress more often and make faster decisions. And with all this flexibility of data and types of study, making use of it as a team doesn't have to be more complex or burdensome. Now this feeds into the next point, which is to articulate standards and processes for analysing and drawing conclusions from all this real-time data. So to maximise the benefit of all this flexibility, when designing a responsive feedback mechanism, it's important to define upfront how long it will run, what the evidence threshold is, what form the data will take, how we will analyse and look at it, on what criteria will base decision-making, and who will be responsible for which parts of that process. And this also relates to the point we've touched on in previous sessions of the curve, on how much evidence is enough. It should be clear from the outset whether this is intended to inform conclusions that will drive micro tweaks, or whether this will inform a major programmatic decision. And it's these kind of considerations that will drive balance to make rapid use of data's implications, with the need to maintain caution and minimize the risk of poor decisions. Once we've considered our data and drawn our conclusions, there should then be a process of keeping the theory of change and implementation strategy and approach documentation live. So we've defined what we wanted to test, we've seen it in action, we've garnered learning and taken a decision about how to use this knowledge. Whether we've validated or not, an assumption inherent in our theory of change, or whether we've learnt how to optimize our implementation approach in a given context. It's important to finalize that loop by reflecting and capturing that learning, not just in a report, but in the documentation that lays out the fundamentals of our program.
Reshma Trasi cannot be with us today, so I will share her thoughts on Challenge 3. In the words of H.L. Mencken, for every complex problem, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. One of our challenges in global development is that we cannot respond to complex problems with oversimplified solutions. For example, if women don't use contraceptives, it may not be enough just to give them information. If children are malnourished, it may not be enough just to provide midday meals in schools. These are complex problems embedded in multifaceted, dynamic environments. How can we design our proposals and our programs to grapple with this complexity? First, we can think of our theory of change as a living document. Personally, I prefer the theory of change to a log frame. It allows us to expose and articulate assumptions. Don't treat your theory of change as a once and done document. Surface and articulate the assumptions we are making about the program and how and why we think it will produce outcomes. Test these assumptions. Revisit the theory of change periodically to assess if our assumptions were correct, if they need to be revised, or if the program needs to pivot. To focus our efforts, be clear as a project team on what we can change and what we cannot influence or change. Second, design for complexity. Think about how you plan to track and adapt to a dynamic implementation context over time. What information about the context, components, stakeholders, influencers, enablers, barriers, and so on would you need in order to respond to a dynamic environment? Think about where you can get this information and how often you want to review it. To be clear, this is not your MEL data. This is data about the context in which you are working. For example, during COVID-19 on the project that I lead, we track 6 things each week in Bangladesh: number of cases, ability to travel, clinic and pharmacy hours, patient volume for contraceptives and menstrual regulation, migrant worker movements, and the response of garment factory associations. Based on this dynamic information, we collectively discuss as a team if we need to pivot in any way. So to design a proposal that can manage complexity, describe how you will track the context to inform pause and reflect moments and support adaptive management. Finally, take a portfolio approach to complex problems. Balance proven strategies with bolder, less certain strategies that allow the exploration of the problem with a different lens. This enables you to benefit from proven practice while still experimenting and learning. For example, if you're exploring non-use of contraceptives, could you explore if consumer psychology could provide deeper insights into women's reasons for non-use? Plan to test early, test often, and adapt based on the lessons learned. I'll now hand over to Christina Synowiec. She will speak through Challenge 4, Ongoing Learning is Not a Priority.
So what I'm going to do now is talk about Challenge 4, and this is a challenge that we identified among our group, which is that ongoing learning is not a priority within current organizations. I think one of the things that is very evident to us is that running a program is incredibly challenging without even adding on the layers related to performance management and adaptive management. And so, when you have constrained resources, it can be really hard to then actually prioritize the time commitment, the skills needed, and other pieces related to actually pushing forward activities for ongoing learning. So what I'm going to do now is talk through some of the potential solutions that can help to tackle the issue of prioritizing ongoing learning within your organization. The first potential solution that we identified was building in feedback and learning as the default moving forward. I think that in order to ensure that responsive feedback mechanisms are actually mainstreamed into any given proposal, you have to ensure that it's also mainstreamed into your actual programmatic approach and your activities moving forward. And so this isn't something where in the proposal phase you want to just have responsive feedback mechanisms slotted into the MURL plan at the end of your proposal. It's something that should be built into ongoing design, implementation, and adaptation activities throughout program implementation. That way you can be sure that feedback and learning are built into activities as an integral part and not as just an additional or separate layer. I think something related to that as well is actually defining concrete deliverables of a given grant that are tied to the learning activities. The second potential solution we identified was demonstrating that learning and adapting is not an extra. It's something that is critical to program success and should be considered value for money. I think for those of us that have actually worked with responsive feedback mechanisms, we've seen how implementing feedback and learning activities actually helps with quality control and serves in many ways as an early warning system. And so by emphasizing in both the proposal process and in conversations with funders that feedback and adaptation will help to keep a program on track, support its success, and actually offer value for money in your activities. That's something that is really important for actually successfully building in some of these activities. And finally, the third solution that we identified was showing donors that feedback and adaptation are more than just a tick box affair. I think this links very much to the previous two solutions that have been identified, but many donors are very aware of people who are just submitting an M&E plan or developing a MURL approach that isn't really something that's integrated into the follow-on activities. This is also really an opportunity for the implementers to emphasize the need to donors to build in a lot of flexibility into program implementation, to be sensitive to complex on-the-ground realities and changing circumstances. And in turn, hopefully donors will also assess proposals based on the quality of the plans for learning that they receive.
Challenge 5, identified by the group. Staff in the organization lack the skills and the needed supportive environment for adaptation. In other words, it is possible for members of staff who are expected to carry out adaptation to lack the needed skills. And then, even if they do, it is also possible for the top hierarchy of the organization to not have created the necessary environment to ensure that adaptation is always taking place in a robust way. To take care of this challenge, we have identified 4 possible solutions, and there may be more when others make their contributions. Number 1, we believe that it is necessary to create an enabling environment to ensure that staff in the organization are able to have the space and are able to develop the skills in order to carry out robust adaptation. We also believe that the systems should be put in place in the organization to ensure that staff are able to do this regularly and in a very robust manner. And this should not just be the staff of the organization alone, it should also include their partners, because it is the case that in some instances, it is not only the staff of the organization that are carrying out, are implementing the program, but they have partners outside the organization who are supporting them to do this. So it is necessary to make sure that not only the staff, but also the partners have the necessary skills and space to be able to do this. The second one is, if the space and the enabling environment is there, it is necessary to make sure that the organization institutionalizes, pause, and reflect as part of the culture of the organization. And thirdly, if this happens, we believe that it is necessary for the organization to make adaptation one of the key performance indicators of the organization, so that adaptation will be one of the things the organization is monitoring and evaluating from time to time, and also that it becomes one of the questions that will be asked to ensure that the organization is performing according to its own mandate. The last one is that it is necessary to ensure that the top hierarchy, the senior management team in the organization, strongly support adaptation in a way that they are always involved and they are always part of the pause and reflect. That way, every staff in the organization would ensure that they are making their contributions and that they are showing a lot of interest and sharpening their skills further to ensure that adaptation takes place continually. Thank you.
Other challenges to an enabling environment for adaptive management and better use of MEL include the lack of flexibility in financial management, transparency, and accountability. Risk orientation and the role of managers, staff capacity, skills, composition and retention, and the flexibility of procurement, contracting, and implementing mechanisms can be detrimental to a context that supports adaptive management. There are, however, several potential solutions to this issue. Donors need to establish standards of practice for contract and agreement officers that reflect the priorities of co-creation and adaptive management, and that emphasize the hiring of officers with project management experience and adaptive management skills. Human resource practices should regularly assess and update requirements for contract officer certification and continuous learning to ensure that contract officers or contract officer representatives develop and possess the fundamental skills necessary to manage awards adaptively, such as collaborating, learning, and adapting, or CLA, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, MEL, and partner engagement. Existing training might be supplemented to build soft skills needed for new roles and relationships with local partners, such as collaborating and facilitating engagement. By rewarding leadership and success in innovative or adaptive procurement and implementation approaches, donors might improve manager commitment to adaptive MEL and overall retention of quality contract officers. To improve communication and transparency, donor organizations need to create the knowledge management platform for the acquisitions and assistance workforce. There might be a need to redefine what is, quote, procurement sensitive, unquote, or to allow for more transparent discussions between donors and partners on how to plan and adapt. Finally, financial forecasting and management processes need to facilitate adaptive planning, allowing financial resources to be moved around while still meeting donor requirements for predictable financial flows and value for money. Processes such as regular budget review and continuous reforecasting are going to be essential.
Hello everyone, my name is Farouk Musa. I work with Society for Family Health Nigeria. I will be taking you through challenge number 7, which is conflicting donor requirement. Now let's just take a few seconds to look at what conflicting donor requirement means. Basically, it means sometimes different parts of the donor agency having different but sometimes very contradictory priorities, especially when it comes to defining results. And where does this leave the implementer or the supplier? What is the implication for the implementer or the supplier? It takes so much time, the supplier and the implementer takes so much time managing contradictions, which sometimes affects program delivery. And we'll be running through 3 recommendations here to see how we can resolve such a challenge. The first recommendation is donors should speak with one voice as an organization. The second recommendation I have is strengthening internal communication within the donor system itself. And then the third recommendation is bring donors close to programs. Now the first recommendation, which is donors should speak with one voice as an organization. Sometimes implementers or suppliers perceive different demands coming from within a single donor, and this of course in the long run affects program delivery. The second recommendation is to try strengthen internal communication within the donor system. This means that donor needs to explore what different units of the donor are looking out for, and then reach a compromise before communicating or engaging the supplier or the implementer, as the case may be. And then the last recommendation is bring donor closer to the programs. I think at this point we need to understand that adaptive learning isn't about command and control. And so here some of the recommendations include having donor staff seconded to work within the program. That way they learn together, and then it makes it easy for both partners to understand exactly what the changes are and what the learnings are. Or secondly, we can have the donor develop a crack team of adaptive donor staff who are fully trained in adaptive methods. Well, when we have a set of staff within the donor, we call them a crack team, that are trained on adaptive methods. It makes it easy for them to understand what is actually happening in terms of learning. And then, delivery becomes very, very easy and straightforward. So thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much to our presenters. If we can get back to the slide that has the summary of the 7 viewpoints. So thank you for sharing those 7 challenges from our working group. And now to kick off our interaction with the audience, we'll have an audience vote on the most important barriers that inhibit work in your experience. So which of these 7 challenges that we've heard about is most important, do you think, for the sector to overcome? And we'll give you a couple of minutes to fill out that poll and tell us which of those challenges is the biggest target, do you think, for our sector to overcome in order to facilitate adaptive proposals. And if we have missed any challenges, then please do take a moment to write those in chat. While everyone is completing that poll question, that also gives our working group members a moment to turn your cameras on so that we can see you for the Q&A. So we'll take just a moment to finish that poll off. Reshma, Farouk, David, Anne, do feel free to turn your cameras on if you like.
Great, and I'm just going to end the poll now, so 10 seconds to cast your final votes. It's interesting, I can see the results that's come through, and you guys will be able to see it just about now.
That's interesting. It looks like number 1 is difficulty designing proposals to accommodate complexity. which I know we've had some potential solutions offered. Second, challenges in analyzing and acting on real-time data, which Abi, I know that you spoke to. Ongoing learning is not a priority, seems to be tied with a lack of flexibility in financial management and accountability. So that's really helpful, thank you. Excellent, so we can see some questions starting to come in through chat. I'd like to welcome as my co-moderator, Ritika Pandey, the leader of the working group. So she'll join me now as co-moderator, and we will open the floor to audience comments and feedback on the presentation. This is obviously an enormous topic, how to create adaptive grants. It's a huge question. We provided one group's perspective. We're sure there will be many other perspectives, ideas, and experience from the audience, and we welcome hearing your views, and these can help to inform the final publication. So we use a slightly different format for Q&A than we have before. You're welcome to type your whole comment or question into chat, or if you prefer, just type, I have a question, or give me the mic, and we'll gladly hand you the virtual mic if you prefer to speak. As it can be a bit more fun sometimes to have the mic. So I can see a question coming in from Mohammed Lehman from MSpace, asking how could the curve evolve a common guideline for integrating responsive feedback into proposals for use by both donors and grantees, because of course those parties need to work together. Could I open the floor to the working group? Would anyone like to address that, about how we might develop a common guideline?
Yeah, I can take a stab. So we did talk about this in our group, and we were trying to think about what guidance we might be able to offer that still is representative of the enormous diversity and complexity of types of funders, types of implementing organizations applying for funds, and diversity within funding mechanisms and types of proposals that people might be applying for. So that's something that we have definitely battled with, and we definitely appreciate some thoughts on. Where we sort of landed was that rather than a kind of prescriptive framework or a prescriptive kind of checklist, we might consider a sort of list of questions to ask yourself through the proposal development process, just like, have I considered this, have I considered that, and kind of framing in a kind of design thinking way of how might we do this, how might we do that. So if anybody has ideas on what we might be able to develop that would be applicable across that diversity of our audience, then we definitely appreciate thoughts.
Yeah, I might comment briefly on that, Sarah. It's difficult, isn't it? You know, I mean, a common guideline for proposals. Well, proposals are product of an environment. So how do you try to get change in the environment, I think, is the first thing. But that said, one observation, I sometimes think there's a bit of a tyranny of the log frame. You know, and but we've seen a movement away from that with increasingly, you know, an uptake in the theory of change, and we've heard a lot about that from the other presenters, because I think that provides a much broader model for defining and approaching a problem. And I think we heard from some of the presenters yesterday. There was a guy from Gates who spoke about this and going in with this sort of hypothesis about the problem. So, but I think that's very much on the part of the donors and their appetite for a sort of initial framing hypothesis rather than a hard and fast set of rules as defined in log frame. So I think that's perhaps one thing. Avoid the tyranny of the log frame if you want to develop a guide. That I'd certainly be a fan. But I think also the question of trust, which is something that came up a lot yesterday, as I heard, when, you know, and the importance of establishing trust among the donors and the project developers, because really I think that is fundamental to people understanding, well, we don't have all the answers here. Development is complex, and therefore we have to accept that we're all in this learning situation together.
Yes, absolutely. So certainly the importance of trust has come up a lot, including yesterday as well. I know there were mentions of the need for donor signals, I suppose, that flexibility and adaptability are something that is genuinely welcomed, and for there to be trust from the grantees' side that is a genuine priority for donors.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, especially on Limon's question and even Linda's question on the question. So yes, at the working group, we did have, again, a lot of discussion about what it should be. And as Abi said, that there were like a lot of discussion that we thought that we can't be really prescriptive, but what we are trying to develop, and right now it's still a work in progress, and actually a lot of your suggestions can actually make it even more sort of helpful, and like with a lot of different promising practices that you all can contribute. So what we have tried to do that in the guidebook that we are developing, apart from talking about the challenges and some of the solutions that we actually presented today, we are actually also compiling the promising practices, and we really invite a lot of you to contribute as well to it, which actually talks about actually an experience of doing this adaptive feedback and how it was applied in a proposal or in a project, and how it was done. So that will actually give you the practical guidance of doing it. So yeah, if anyone wants to add anything there.
Yes, we do have the additional question from Linda Sussman that you mentioned, Ritika. So just to share that with everyone, if you haven't seen it, Linda has asked whether the working group can share the questions that you referred to that help to consider reflective management in proposals and requests for proposals. So what might be some of the language, some of the questions that are used to ask for those proposals, and also to examine those proposals for adaptability. Any comments from anyone?
This is Reshma. If I may jump into Mohammed's question, which I think is a good one. And I think it's something for us to also be striving towards, right? So I completely agree. I think there's the barriers and the solutions on what could be done on the donor side, I think are a little bit different from what we might be looking at from the implementer's perspective. And I think we're getting at a lot of these issues and surfacing some practical solutions during the summit. So, on the implementer side, I think it's a lot more interesting and relevant and salient for implementers to know, how to integrate this into integrate into proposals, but actually also how to implement rapid feedback mechanisms during implementation, and what does that look like? What does a pause reflect session look like? And I think this morning's really great panel is a testament to that. On the solutions or the barriers on the donor side are a little bit different, right? So what do procurement mechanisms look like? What does a donor risk appetite look like? What's the value add? What's the value for money for implementing rapid feedback mechanisms? But I think there's also an overlapping territory, right, between which is the interacting space between the donor and the implementer, which is what do you look for in a proposal, and how do you assess a proposal for its adaptive capacity, if you will, for lack of a better word. And so it might be interesting for us to, take from the summit, and to be able to sort of organize the sessions into these sort of three categories. What does it look like from the donor side, barriers as well as solutions, the implementer side, and then maybe that overlapping piece. Just a thought.
Yes, so I'm sure that would be very welcome if we could develop that. So one question for that a number of people may want to speak to, but David, I know that you specifically mentioned in your presentation, there was a mention of how to make adaptation an organizational KPI, so a specific KPI that is demanded and reportable on, and making learning and adapting something for which we are formally accountable as a KPI. So the question is, what does this look like? How do you measure and account for learning and adaptation? What is good? What is bad? Especially since KPIs are often numbers. How can you have accountability for learning and adaptation? So I'm curious for anyone's comments on that.
Yes, this is a very good question. The truth is that the idea here is we are looking at a situation where the organization makes adaptation part of its culture. And as long as there is no way of measuring whether this is happening or not, it will most likely be something that will be neglected. If we really want adaptation to become one part of the culture of the organization, there must be a way by which at the senior management level, there is something that they are measuring, and they are seeing from time to time, maybe every quarter, how much adaptation is taking place, either in terms of proposal development or in terms of implementation. If there's at least one KPI or two KPIs that specifically speak to proposal development and maybe implementation, then it is very clear that at the senior management level, they will know that they are being measured, and they will make sure that they are asking questions from the staff, and they are ensuring that the staff ensure that adaptation is taking place. If there is no accountability measure in the organization, then it's most likely that the issue of adaptation will be totally lost within a very short time, even if at the beginning there is a lot of momentum to ensure that adaptation is part of the organizational culture. But it's a way of ensuring that it becomes part of what is being talked about all the time and is being measured. That is why it is necessary for there to be at least one or two indicators, speaking to the issue of adaptation.
Sarah, I might just sort of come in on that as well. One of the ways that we think about adaptive capacity, if you like, from an adaptive leadership standpoint, is the ability to frame and reframe a problem, or reframe a question, and recognizing the technical and adaptive elements of the problem, as we talked about in the proposal. So understanding that there's a large element of technical work that needs to be done, but sometimes we articulate an adaptive problem as a technical one. So one way of thinking about the kind of adaptive capacity that a team or an individual might have is their ability to reframe a problem in a more adaptive way. So that's perhaps another way of looking at it, and that's something that will be practiced and referred to and developed as a particular skill set.
Yes, that's fascinating, the thought of distinguishing reframing technical problems as adaptive learning questions. I know that several people have mentioned a learning culture and the importance of building a learning culture. So how do you build a learning culture? It feels like one of those things that is easy to aspire to, but also quite easy to forget in the pressures of the day-to-day, much like eating well or being fit. So how do you take learning culture from an aspiration to something that the organization does regularly? Any thoughts from anyone?
I mean, just reflections from our work, and we're a very small organization, so it will be different possibly in a much bigger organization. But I think you can consider approaching it like you would any sort of behavior change program or any change management program, where you think about sort of understanding the barriers that people might face in enacting that behavior. So in sharing learning and being open to and transparent about what's gone wrong effectively. And considering what might motivate people to do that and what might trigger that to start with. And could be that you create a kind of prestige around it, and like, oh, you know, great, you know, we've had Sarah's leading a learning session this week. What a fantastic achievement Sarah's done this week. Even if it's sharing something that didn't go as you expected, it's about celebrating the process of learning in the same way that you would celebrate any positive behavior shift in any other context.
I wanted to add to your comments. I think from a USAID perspective, I think that it shouldn't be as much about the learning agenda or the policies that need to be in place, because that's sort of how we operate. But to build a culture that embraces learning, I think the community needs to really know and be a part of decisions about how you're going to use the learning. And I think if you're behind, like, talk more about the use and less about the active learning to engage people and realize that it has value and that it is something they want to do, regardless of whether there is a particular mandate or agenda in place.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense.
Maybe just to comment briefly on that, completely agree with everything that the panelists have said. I think that also, you know, it's modeled behavior. I'm a great believer that, you know, ignorance is an underrated virtue. And for people to articulate that and talk about what they don't know, what they're not certain of, particularly people in positions of authority, that can set a very strong signal to other people. And I think the other thing, learning is one of those things that's seen as universally positive, but there can be downsides to learning, you know, because I might have to give something up. I might have to give something up that I'm quite attached to, my way of doing things, my mental model, my belief in this is the way to do it in order to try something new out. So understanding that learning may involve issues of loss for the people who want to change in the way that they're doing something or approaching something. So it's, you know, it can have sensitivities around that.
Yes, we have a question from Reshma saying that she liked the 4 tenets that were presented this morning from Peter Senge's approach by Elizabeth Solomitsos. So maybe Elizabeth could remind us of those again. She's mentioned we really don't retain much, do we? As indicated in Helen Blackholder's presentation. So Elizabeth, when you are on the line, please do share those again.
I am here, and I have to say that I don't have them embedded in even my own memory, but one is personal mastery, and I'm not sure who's navigating the slides, but if there's a possibility of getting back to that slide, that would be wonderful. So yeah, personal mastery, mental models,
shared values.
Thank you. And, shared values. Yeah. And the fourth one.
And the team learning, and
that's right. Thank you.
Yeah.
How's that for a pop quiz? Very unfair.
There we go. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. So yeah, just I'm one who always has to keep everything in my notes and fresh at hand. Not that I have the words all embedded in my memory. But I was reflecting actually on that shared vision piece a little bit more earlier today, thinking about donor implementing partner relationships and thinking on a very personal level about the kind of relationship. So my project is a USAID funded project, and for those who work on USAID funded projects, they know that the relationship with the AOR or the COR, the Agreement Officer's Representative or the Contracting Officer's Representative, that's the technical person at USAID, the relationship between that person and the project is critical, in my opinion, for the success of the project. And to make that work well, I think that issue of having a shared vision is one of the key components that enables the donor and the implementer to, you know, sort of have that meeting of the minds and have that space in which they can see how they're on the same side and how their complementary roles are there to achieve the shared vision. And so that's the one that's been on my mind lately. And so I think that if there's a shared vision around these processes and the adaptive approaches, the learning organization, et cetera, then that's going to play a really key role in helping that relation, you know, helping us achieve the learning culture. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So we have time for perhaps one or two more questions. I can see one from Ugochukwu Osigwe, who said, while a theory of change has been suggested as one way to go toward a more complex description of a problem in its context, is a theory of change the best or the only way that we can accommodate and capture complexity? Any thoughts on that?
I can give it a shot. I think that a theory of change is not the only way to capture the complexity of a problem or a program or a context. But, and perhaps I'm a bit of a purist, I still think that understanding the pathway to which you're trying to achieve a goal is still critical. So even if you don't require the theory of change for that purpose, to understand complexity, I think you'll still need to have a theory of change in place to have an effective program. That's my opinion, and I welcome alternative views.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, again, you know, theory of change is just a sort of imperfect description of the problem as we understand it at the outset, but the nature of this adaptive work is that our understanding deepens and sharpens the more we get into it. And so the ability to reframe and remodel and revisit that theory of change is fundamentally important. And so the value of the theory of change, as I see it, is it's a way of expressing our assumptions and the learning questions that really need to be tested as we go along. I think the only other thing that I find of interest, I've been doing quite a bit of work with the Sabin Institute, who are setting up this global network of immunization managers and supporting them through adaptive leadership. And they, there's this model called the Strong Field Framework, which looks at how you achieve change across a field. So it's a really high degree of complexity, and they look at things like standards of practice, the knowledge base, what's the leadership and grassroots support, or what's the funding and supporting environment look like. So it's a much more holistic, and I think Gavi itself actually uses that sort of field framework to see how you get change at a very sort of distributed and complex level of change. But that's the other one. It's just quite an interesting sort of counterpoint, I think, to the theory of change.
Excellent. Thank you very much to all of our working group members and to our audience for their contributions and questions. We encourage you to continue sharing contributions, promising practice, and potential solutions that could and should be included in the final publication. Please share those with thecurve@mcsashi.com, including your name so that we can recognize you as a contributor. And the working group will be issuing a publication of their advice in the coming weeks. So thank you so much to everyone. Certainly appreciate your weeks of cooperative work on this. Up next, we will build on this adaptive grant session by sharing a case study of promising practice. The Gates Foundation Nigeria Country Office and AFANET will share how they work together to design a grant with flexibility at its core.